Hello, Ephraim. Can you hear me now? Great. That's wonderful. All right. So hopefully momentarily we'll have Jasmine join us. Okay. So were you not able to hear me at any point?
No.
Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. All right. So I had a lot of things opened. And I guess it was simply came down to that because that's all that I changed is I shut everything down. I'm so sorry. Okay, so with the assignment, with the test, the written test that I have for you, right? I ask you to go to approach one of a few interpretations to the Spanish colonization of the Americas. The first one is court history, which defends the Spanish and contends that the Spanish brought progressive, quote, civilized institutions and ways to the Americas. The second one is a 180 from that and adheres to the Black legend and contends that the Spanish are the antithesis or the opposite of what we would expect of society today. And then the third one says, you know what, we're not going to make villains or heroes of anybody. We're just going to contend that it is what it is. And 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 this is how what happened then has contributed to where we are today. All right. And so just some ideas. Hello, Jasmine. Jasmine, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for your patience, both of you, and your perseverance. So the first one, right, is you could contend that for the early modern era, that the Siete Partidas Castilian Constitution was pretty progressive. That was brought to the Americas, and then of course it tackled an array of subjects, property, uh, just criminal law, you name it, trade. So at any rate, it was all encompassing. And not only that, like when you see with the Recopilación de las Leyes de Indias, is that each of the viceroyalties kind of adapted the Castilian constitution to the realities of their viceroyalty. So demographics, who lived there, what conditions were like, what were the mainstays of the economy, those were all considered in their unique version of the Constitution of Castile. You have cities and other areas and offices that received fueros, and fueros were certain privileges and rights that kept you from the tyrannical arbitrariness of the king, where the king or queen could just do as he or she pleased. You had certain rights and protections in the fueros that were included in this constitution. You had a contractual notion of the king or queen, whereby, long before, the English like to brag about their Magna Carta and the English Revolution, this English Civil War, I'm sorry, from 1642 to 49, whereby they made sure that King Charles could not, he was beheaded. They made sure that he could not rule as he pleased, but he had to rule with the consent of Parliament. But the Spanish had notion of the general well-being, the bien común of the people, and so the crown could not do as he just simply as he or she pleased. There was a contractual notion that both people in the contract had to do their part. You have, and then almost a notion of like divine right mixed with it, like the Chinese mandate of heaven notion. Then you also could engage in somewhat civil disobedience and saying, I obey, but I don't comply. Obedezco, pero no cumplo. If you felt like you were told from a superior to do something that was immoral or impractical, and that was integrated into the Constitution as early as 1528 here in the Americas, You had the right of appeal. If someone was mistreating you and you wanted justice above his head, you could do that with the audiencia. You also had the juez de residencia, or los juicios de residencia. And that's whereby they would put your local superior under house arrest and give opportunities for people to bring forth grievances against him for misuse of rule, misuse of power, etc. Don Juan de Oñate was removed from power in New Mexico under the juez de residencia. So, you could make the argument, if you chose to support number one, that the Spanish brought somewhat, for their time period, for the early modern era, progressive government and sophisticated law. They had their jurists who interpreted the law and again adapted it to the circumstances of their viceroyalty. And then for better and for worse, you have Christianity, and Christianity is very integral to a lot of Hispanic facets of culture, right? From marriage ceremonies and asking her to marry you, all the way through the wedding date, the wedding itself, to compadrasco, right? Having godfathers and godmothers, the rites of passage, the quinceañera, the church got involved. That was kind of an amalgamation of an Aztec rite of passage and a Spanish one. And so Christianity, for better and for worse, was introduced. Then you have literature and the arts and sciences. You had chroniclers like Oviedo and Cabeza de Vaca. You had Renaissance writers like Castellanos and Cervantes de Salazar. You had Christian humanists, right, like Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. And Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, in this Hispanic literature book, she says basically, and this is a rough translation, on page 147, it's in Spanish, and I'm not going to use my horrible Spanish pronunciation, but try to approximate an immediate translation. With that, I prosecuted, or I continued, always diligent, as I have said, my passages of study to the summit of sacred theology. So notice she stayed loyal to the church and to the Catholic faith, but she said, but to get to there, I subir por los escalones de las ciencias y artes humanas. I climbed up the steps of the sciences and the human arts. And so her epistemology, her way to knowledge, was very progressive for that time period. Through the arts and sciences, she wanted to get to the eternal truths, as well as the Bible. And then you had satirists, and satire is very, very integral to the health of a political atmosphere, according to the Enlightenment and to the liberal movement, liberalism, classical and neoliberalism, whereby you should be able to be critical of all institutions, all public figures, all customs, etc. And Lizardi did just that in Mexico. And so they brought the arts and sciences, not that they didn't have any in Mexico. Of course, the Aztec did, as we've gone over, but they brought, this to the missions on La Frontera, on the frontier of New Mexico, Pimeria Alta, which is Arizona, California, Texas, Florida. Okay. They brought stratified complex society and trade. And according to anthropology, that was a step for humanity toward modernity, bringing these things to the North American continent. In some cases where it was lacking, in some cases it was not lacking, as we've gone over with the Pueblo, for instance, in New Mexico, in the Four Corners. If you want to choose the second one, conflict history, you could, in line with the Black legend, right, that the Spanish were the antithesis, they were the opposite of what we hold dearly today, as far as egalitarianism, everyone on equal footing and everyone equally important and valuable, democratic government and so forth, right? That they were the antithesis, they were the opposite of that. So they brought in a very hierarchical and arguably inequitable society. right, as villains. So you had the Council of the Indies were handpicked, a small handpicked group of Spanish men that made that altered and played with the Castilian Constitution and made the laws applicable to the Americas. You had the virrey, or the vice king, the viceroy, who represented the image, the power, and fear of the crown here in the Americas, and had ultimate executive power to execute the laws of the Americas. You had the Audiencia, who were handpicked Spaniards who were judges, and they had a lot of power in arbitrating disputes and deciding upon guilt or innocence in criminal cases. You had the governors and the hated corregidores, and the corregidores came in and they exacted tribute, they collected taxes, and they could corregir, or correct, or change the decisions made by the mayor and the city councils. And so you had pretty much a strongly centralized, hierarchical Spanish colonization process and system that was set up if you adhere to this history. The Consulado made the ultimate decisions on the economy, because it was not a capitalist economy, it was a mercantilist economy. And so they made the ultimate decisions as to who could trade and deal in what commodities. They granted monopolies on the big money makers, like in mining and with sugar and cocoa and the big money makers. You had the repartimiento, and those were public works that the Native Americans had to pay as tribute to the Spanish crown, and building roads and churches and working in the mines. And of course, there was a lot of exploitation in the mines in Mexico and in Bolivia and near Peru. You have a very sophisticated, very entrenched tax system, supposedly, that the Spanish set up in the Americas, and collecting sales taxes and demanding 1/5 of all major commodities and income and wealth. The Royal Quinto, the Situado system made sure that they allocated the tax revenue from one viceroyalty to the next, because some viceroyalties did much better economically on a macro level than others did. And so they wanted to allocate from the rich viceroyalties to the poor ones as far as the cost of maintaining the kingdom. The encomiendas were supposed to have ended under the new laws of 1542, but they lasted much longer than that. And that was when, as a conqueror, a self-styled conqueror, you came in and you were granted the forced labor of the Native Americans beneath you. And so that was very exploitative, that system. And J.H. Eliot says that the English colonies were, compared to the Spanish in the early modern era, just simply more democratic, and not necessarily by design, not necessarily by the deliberate attempt of the Parliament and of the Crown back in England. As we see, right, there's going to be a great misunderstanding over what constituted the rights of English colonists that's going to culminate in the War for Independence. So clearly they weren't along the same lines, but de facto, as things just ended up being, especially if you adhere to the salutary neglect thesis, the American colonies were left alone more. They didn't have, corregidores and these different royal officials to come in and exact tax, tribute, and et cetera from the colonists. They also established as early as 1619 in the English colonies the assemblies, and the assemblies became known as the voice of the colonial people. And so you could make a contrast as somewhat J.H. Eliot does in Empires of the Atlantic World in this book. He does somewhat of a contrast. And so you have the Royal Patronato, and that was granting the Spanish crown power over the church and the Catholic Church and the Christian religion over the Americas. So they, in some ways, could be ruthless with that. They implemented at a very small scale, albeit, but they implemented the infamous Spanish Inquisition in Mexico on more than one occasion. They had the famous requerimiento, and that was the requirement. That was when they gave them 24 hours to accept the Roman Catholic Church and the Christian faith, or else they would declare holy war upon them. They had power of lay investiture, so the crown could handpick bishops, archbishops, priests, right, and set up dioceses, and also send the friars out into the missions. And you could depict the missions, right, in as you saw in our argumentative assignment, in conflict history fashion, as guilty of cultural genocide, micromanaging the lives of they were called neophytes, the Native American converts on these missions. Remember, they would capture them if they were away without the proper papers, if they escaped or left the missions and didn't return. And so you can go that route as well. And then with functional history, you could look at how, especially with cultural syncretism is the Spanish and the Native Americans embraced one another's ways and kind of made an amalgamation, a mixture of their institutions and of their ways. So you see it in religion, you see it in their folk ways, you see it in their literature, like through Garcilaso de la Vega. He was really big in being a Spanish Roman Catholic, but also being very proud of the Inca people, and being a product of the union of both of them. But then you had people like Sarmiento, who said the problem with Argentina are the native gauchos, the native barbarian Native American Argentines, cowboys, and said that we need to people the Americas with more Europeans and bring more European influence. And so he was complaining about a reality, however, that's set forth. And so when you look at countries like Mexico, as connected to this class, Mexico was very much a mestizo nation, demographically in its bloodline, a mixture of Spanish and Native American. And he was complaining and concerned about that. And then Whig history of Spanish and Spanish colonies. You could say that the Spanish colonies went their own route. That wasn't necessarily good as far as inequity, right? Imbalance of power and opportunities and privileges, et cetera, and wealth, aversion to novelty. Again, that's very slanted history, English Whig history. And miscegenation is interethnic sex and marriage and procreation. And so, yeah. Are there any questions or comments? Anything that I didn't make quite clear?
No.
Okay, so do you guys feel fairly well about the direction that you'd like to go? You don't have to know just yet. You have all week. But I'm hoping that this helped you a little bit as far as giving you some ideas in approaching one of these three historical interpretations of Spanish colonization. So remember, the first one, the first route that you could take is either supporting or rebutting or saying how false it is, right? Spanish court history of the Spaniards bringing a lot of modernity and progressive ways to the Americas, especially to the frontier regions of present US. You could address conflict history as the second option, and that's the Spanish were villains, basically. They were the antithesis of what we hold dear today. They set up an inequitable, hierarchical, exploitative colonial system, and we should learn from it as far as what not to do and what not to tolerate today. And you could support or go against that. And then the third one is just, I don't think I did that well in the third one, and I apologize, but just a functional approach and saying, hey, it is what it is. It was what it was. And this is how the Spanish colonies became, Mexico, and how the Hispanic people are what they are today, with the amalgamation of the Spanish um, and the indigenous and the Native Americans. All right, and so that's all I have to share. I'm going to write down on my notes here. I'm giving you 10 extra credit points for sure, for hanging in there with me today. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I must have had just too many things opened on my computer, because once I shut everything down and restarted my computer, everything was fine. So thank you to the two of you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate both of you, and look forward to seeing you next week. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine. Efrain, are you okay? Good. Thumbs up. I love it. All right. All right. Well, gracias por todo. Very, very much so. All right. And you guys have a good week.
You too.
Thank you. All right. Have a good one.